It's time now for the Success is Subjective podcast. Here is your host and therapeutic consultant for young adults only, Joanna Lilley.
Hi, and welcome to the show. I know the anxiety that comes from watching a loved one struggle with a nonlinear path. This podcast was created to fight back against the narrow picture of success painted by social media. Each week, we share authentic stories from people who changed course, failed, and ultimately found their own definition of success. These are the stories you need to hear to prove that changing your mind is common, and you don't have to have it all figured out at 18. If you're a parent or a young adult looking for a little proof, you're home. Now, let's get into today's episode. If you'd like to explore how I can help your young adult, schedule a free consultation through my website link in the show notes. Today, my guest is Allan Capp. Allan is a 40-year-old surfer, yoga teacher / practitioner, husband, dog dad, and business owner. He lives in Dominical, Costa Rica. He has worked many different kinds of jobs throughout his life, and he would say his career is defined by leadership and management. He does not have a college degree, which we'll get into greater detail during this interview. He loves spending time in the ocean, mountains, and forests, and he can be really extroverted, but he recharges his internal battery with introversion. Now, before we jump into the interview itself, I do want to say something about the work that Allan is a part of down in Costa Rica. First, if you do know me personally, you would know that I've been to Costa Rica 7 times, mostly in my adult life. If you don't know me, that might come as a surprise because most people don't go back to the same country over and over, right? If you have any type of wanderlust, you're often curious to explore different places, which I still am, but there is something about Costa Rica that is just captivating. Visiting there can be life-changing, especially for a young adult who is really at a crossroads or adrift. And a big part of the program that Allan runs is yoga and mindfulness, which I'm also mentioning here because we ran out of time during our interview, just candidly, and he didn't get to highlight the key parts of Pure Life. I'm sharing this because it's not just important to mention, but rather it's important to me personally. It's how I get grounded. It's a part of my personal life. And so anyways, it's also partly why I keep going back to Costa Rica. So if you aren't familiar with this program, definitely check them out. The links in the show notes. Again, we barely skim the surface about the work that Allan is doing. I'd encourage you to check it out. And if you've never visited Costa Rica, please go visit. It is a beautiful country. And there is something about the Pura Vida way that will slow down our American lifestyle. So another reason why clearly I'm putting in a plug for most young people to go check this place out. Okay, I've talked enough. Let's jump into the interview. Here's Allan. All right, Allan, I'm so excited to be doing this interview with you. And I think I'm maybe extra excited knowing that you happen to be in Costa Rica while I am doing this from the comfort of my very cold Michigan, wintered home.
Awesome. I'm super stoked to be here too. It's funny. I do these Zooms and different, things like that, video calls, and I'm usually in a tank top, and people are like, "It's freezing where I am."
You look sun-kissed. We were just talking about this. I was like, clearly you live in Central America. All right, well, let's just jump right in because I don't actually know the full story of how you got to where you are today, which is what we want to get to. So why don't you tell our listeners, where did you actually grow up and what was the messaging in which you were being told either by your family or kind of the community or region in which you were raised on what you're supposed to be doing after high school?
Yeah, that's awesome. So I kind of grew up in a few places, but the funny thing more recently, I guess in the last, I don't know how many decade, I grew up in the Ozarks in southern Missouri, and nobody used to know where the Ozarks, nobody had ever heard of that, very few. And now when I say I grew up in the Ozarks, people are like, "Oh my gosh, that show." And so it's funny because I grew up and literally 30 or 40 minutes from where that show is. So, but I was born in Texas. So I was born in Texas, then moved to Missouri, kind of the southern Missouri Ozark area when I was 8 years old. But it's just funny because now everybody knows where this little place, kind of backwoods little place was. So
is that where you were when you went through high school too, or did you move somewhere else?
Yeah. So I was at elementary school when we left Dallas, Texas, and then moved to the Ozarks. We actually moved from Dallas because where I was growing up as a little kid was a pretty rough area. And so, gang violence and shootings and so we went from that, like city, Dallas, 80s, the crack epidemic, like that. I grew up in that, to moving to the middle of nowhere in the Ozarks in Missouri. So that was pretty dramatic change, like early on in life. Yeah. And I always was that kid, and I'm kind of jumping ahead, but I was always that kid that was, really active, hyperactive, constantly, into things, climbing trees, climbing buildings, like anything. I mean, even from really little, my mom has stories of like, her in the kitchen and like looking out and seeing me like at 3 years old, like climbing on top of a carport, and just like, oh my God. So I was always that like curious, excitable, just like active, adventurous kid. So where that kind of translated and pretty early turned into struggles and challenges for me is I didn't really fit in very well in like a classroom. So even kindergarten, I mean, as early as kindergarten, it was like, and it was always this phrase that I heard throughout my life, especially in the school setting, of, man, he's so creative. He has so much potential. If he could just do X, Y, or Z, if he could just behave, if he could just listen, if he could just sit still. But luckily, I had a really loving family growing up. I grew up pretty like conservative, religious, kind of Southern Baptist, and I definitely had some struggles with that later on in life. But yeah, I luckily, my family was really caring and loving and supportive. But I definitely was kind of in trouble from a very young age, and I think I think part of that is just it was always kind of like square peg round hole. Like it wasn't that there was anything necessarily wrong with me or school, but we weren't a good fit. That really structured environment. So my sister is 3 years older than me. We're total opposites. And I know that happens a lot in families. So she was like, and I love my sister. We have a great relationship. I have, niece and nephew, and they're awesome. And we grew up very different in the same household. Like my sister was a rule follower. She was, did straight A student, all that kind of stuff. And so we were pretty polar opposites in that way. She wanted to be inside reading, and I wanted to be outside, like digging a hole or finding the animals or, doing whatever. So.
I'm just picturing this perfectly, where you're like, yeah, your mom might have had a heart attack if she saw your sister scale the carport. Would be like, oh my gosh, but you doing it, it's still like terrifying, but that was totally your MO, right?
It's like, that's Allan. Of course he's doing that. Like, where is he?
All right. So where did this lead you? Like, what did you end up doing after high school then? Because I'm just picturing this young man who's like you said, square peg in a round hole academically for as long as possible. And then is there an opportunity where you can kind of bust through the confines or what is typically recommended? Or what did you end up doing?
Yeah. So where I did succeed in high school, and again, I had some really cool people. I had a psychology teacher and a shop teacher and a PE teacher, and kind of your like stereotypical, the teachers that encouraged kind of the alternative, like, I was into skateboarding and I played, guitar in a punk rock band and like sang and played guitar. And so I had a music teacher that, and an art teacher that encouraged that. And again, big credit to my mom. Like she was always supportive, even if she didn't understand it, in the sense of like those kinds of things, like skateboarding or art or music, those kinds of things. She was like, I don't know what you're doing with your hair. And like, this music sounds horrible. Like you're screaming and it's really loud. As long as it's like, at your friend's house, I'm fine if you do it. So I think I just leaned harder into the areas that I did well in. And even in school, there was subjects like, again, psychology or history or I was the typical ADHD, ADD kid that if I'm into it, I can make an A, I can excel. If I wasn't into it, or I found it annoying, or I found it bored, or I didn't see the point in it, I didn't care if I got an F. I didn't care what that teacher thought of me. And so that did create a lot of conflict, because it's, again, that idea of you have so much potential. If you would just apply yourself, if you would just stay out of trouble, you could do so good. And I'm like, that was confusing at times, to be told, in one way, like, oh, you're so great, you're so amazing. And then why are you such a bad kid? Why are you getting in so much trouble? Why are you not even trying? Mm-hmm. And so I think that developed in me a narrative of school failure. Like school was not the place mm-hmm. overall that I did well. Like I did well in some places there and with certain relationships there, but it wasn't a place I went to like succeed. It was a place I went for social mm-hmm. interaction and for extracurricular activities, which ultimately got me in a lot of trouble as well. I got into drugs and alcohol and partying and those kinds of things. And yeah, again, I mean, part of that is just like experimenting and figuring out at that age, like who I am and what I do and what I want to do. And school, I kind of gave up on school in high school, and I just didn't care anymore. So the other big thing that was kind of a pivotal moment during that time in my life was my father was diagnosed with brain cancer, and he died. And so that was like this huge pivotal moment, where everything changed. Like the life that I knew completely changed when he got sick. And so, and obviously I'll get to that in the way that like that impacted where I'm at now and the work that I do with young people and loss and grief and trauma and, all those kinds of things. I didn't know what that was when I was a kid. I was just confused and scared and trying to like navigate this huge thing. But what it turned in for me, it turned into anger. I didn't understand. I was confused and I was just angry at the world. And so I had always had like that kind of edge and anger within me, but it got, worse. And then, so I just kind of lashed out and didn't really know how to deal with things emotionally. I didn't understand what was going on. Why me, And so I just, and I think a good example is like where my 17 years old, 16 years old, my friends are all worried about like prom or, this or that. And I'm like, what's the meaning of life? Like my dad just died and I just saw him die in our house. And so I was questioning and like coming to the terms of like big real stuff so the other stuff, like the typical high school stuff, I was like, that's not important. Like it didn't matter. And so I think that was a big turning point for me. And it made me grow up really fast. And so I think through that, instead of going the school route, because I had counselors telling me, you got to go to college. That's what you do. You finish high school and then you get into a good college, and then that good college gets you a good job. And I was like, I hate school. I've hated school my whole life. I'm not going to sign up for another 4 years as soon as I'm done. I mean, I barely graduated.
Optional education, mind you.
I'm like, are you kidding me? So even in high school, I started working. So I started working like a restaurant job and like construction. And so again, that was and that was even before my dad got sick and that kind of stuff happened. But for me, work became that place where I was successful. So I had a job with, again, bunch of different jobs growing up, but that was where I started becoming successful. And even, pretty young, I got promoted to like assistant manager of like the restaurant. And so I was doing, opening and closing, and I had more and more responsibilities and the cash register and the till and all those, so I was learning skills. I was with people that were in their, college aged guys that were, and people that were in their 20s. And so I was like, oh man, I got my car. I could pay for my own things. The freedom of work was what really motivated me way more than school. It was like, oh, I'm making money, and this is a source of freedom.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So I am excited to hear kind of the, like, I know what you're doing now, like where you are, the role that you're in, like what you represent in terms of the connection of the work that you're doing. But clearly there is a huge gap between what you just talked about and you getting to like that place where you are now. So not that I want you to skim all of the like points, but what I would love for you to do is just really try to highlight some of those like transition points, like where did you work? Where did you go? Leading to where you are now, not because I want to minimize parts of the story, but instead I just want like top level journey so people can hear some of the twists and turns that you took to get from that like assistant manager at this restaurant in the Ozarks to where you are and what it is that you're doing now.
Yeah. So, as I said, like work kind of became the the way for me to be successful. And so I just kept going on that path. And I think, a lot of the things, so I'll give an example, like the first job is construction. And so just doing dirty, like cleaning out underneath the house, crawl space, job site cleanup. What I learned through that and through all these other jobs is, I can learn all sorts of jobs. But it's the work ethic, and it's the taking initiative, and it's kind of these like transferable skills I started identifying at that pretty young age. And then I would, whether consciously or unconsciously, I would do those at the next job. Right. So I got tired of working in the restaurant and then went into, landscaping. And so but those skills of showing up on time, working really hard, asking my supervisor, like building a relationship with my coworkers and my supervisor, and being able to say, hey, do you need anything else before I leave? Like those little things I noticed over time started adding up to me, either getting a raise or getting a promotion. And so I think that was like a through line that continued. I left the Ozarks when I was about 18 and went out to Oregon. Again, I had been in some trouble, and it was one of those things where I needed a fresh start for a few different reasons. So pretty much like left everything I knew, drove my little Honda out across country, which was super cool. And again, I know I'm kind of going to tangents here, but I think that's also that through line of just being open to try things. And like in doing that trip, I met people that were in my life for years, right? Became really close friends. When I got to Oregon, I was doing a summer volunteer internship type thing with the Bureau of Land Management. And so I learned to run a chainsaw. I learned to work on trails, like building hiking trails, stuff I'd never done before. I went backpacking for the first time. Because in the Ozarks, I grew up like hunting and fishing and being in the outdoors a lot, and like, riding dirt bikes and skateboarding, but I hadn't like been in the wilderness. And so it was when I went to Oregon, I think that was the next like big turning point, is when I went out west, and I drove across the southern part of the states, went up through California along the coast, all the way up to the Pacific Northwest. And I was just blown away, like the mountains, the ocean, the rivers. The scale of the West is so different. And so I think it was one of those things where I got there and I was trying to like start new friend circle, new habits. And again, it wasn't 100% conscious, but I was just like needed to start over. And I knew that. And so in doing that, I would have an opportunity and I would go for it. And then that would turn into another opportunity. So that summer volunteer position with the BLM, because I worked really hard and because I developed a relationship with my boss and was like, made sure, like, what do you need from me? How, I want to learn more. I want to learn how to drive the truck. I want to learn how to back up the trailer and like, run bigger equipment. I learned how to run a backhoe, like things like that. I was like, I never thought I would do that. And in doing that, a paid position opened the next season. And then he hired me as a paid employee. So that volunteer thing, that summer, 4-6 month volunteer gig turned into a paid position with the Bureau of Land Management, with a government position, which was super cool. And so then that just kind of continued. So I did kind of go back into school, the school idea at that point, because I knew people that were in college, and out west it was different. People were really into it. It was just a different environment. And so I was like, oh, maybe I'll go into maybe I will look at college and do like natural resources, because I was doing this job that I really liked in that field. Went back to a community college. I think I did 2 semesters, and back core gen ed stuff. And I was like, I basically was like, I don't need this degree to do the job. I already have the job. And actually I can just, through working the job, I can work my way up, and in the same amount of time, be at the same place as if I had the degree, a 4-year bachelor's degree. And so that kind of ended up happening multiple times. I started working through that job. I started working with teenagers doing community service for getting in trouble, which was me when I was younger. And so I started working with these kids on the crew. I was like the Bureau of Land Management guy, and we're like chopping wood and building trail. And I'm like, these kids were me when I was 14, 15, and I loved it. I loved working with those kids. And so that kind of and I was good at it. I was we had fun, and, I could hold my own, and it was just a good fit. and we work hard. And so I was like, oh, maybe I'll be a teacher. Like, I think I had people be like, you'd be really good working with young, with kids. And so I was like, okay. So I looked into that whole process, and you have to go back to school. And I didn't have an undergrad degree. So I was always looking at starting over at a 4-year degree. And eventually it just got to the point where I was in my mid-20s, and I was like, I'm not going to start a bachelor's degree at, in my mid-20s, early 20s with all this work experience. It kind of just like stopped making sense at a certain point. So yeah, I mean, again, that's like a lot of different threads there, but ultimately like work was the way that I got work, and networking and building relationships and doing a good job and having years of experience that was transferable to whatever job I was applying for next. And I think the big thing is being able to like articulate that, and being able to talk with someone, sit down in an interview and be like, yeah, I don't actually know this specific thing, or I don't have the exact things that you're listing on the job requirements, but I've done all these other things, and I know I can learn this probably pretty quick. And so there was multiple, I think, jobs that I got in doors that were open because I just did it. I just put myself out there and just did stuff. And if I didn't know how to do it, I was determined to figure out how, right? And so I think that's where like my education, there are a lot of things that you learn. I think people do learn in the college setting. And again, over time, I took college classes and went back a few different times. So I spent time in that college environment. And what I really learned, and a lot of the work I do with our students now and with young people now, is that there's lots of ways to get there. They both require hard work. They both require sacrifice. They both require learning transferable skills. Right. And and they both paths, there's lots of ways to do it. And there's some similarities with like what you're going to have to do through that process.
Okay, so you just kind of alluded to this, the students that you're helping now. So just shameless plug. Why don't you tell folks, what is your actual job title, and who do you work for? What do you do?
Yeah, so I'm a co-owner and executive director for Pure Life. Pure Life Adventure is a therapeutic gap program in Costa Rica. So we work with adolescents and young adults, and they come to Costa Rica and it's around a 12-week program. There's, sometimes it's a little shorter, sometimes a little longer, but it's really set up as like a therapeutic gap experience. So they're coming to Costa Rica to work on their mental health primarily, and that can range from challenges with executive functioning, depression, anxiety, substance use, a whole range. You don't have to, there's lots of students that come to Pure Life that are just kind of a little rudderless. Like they're just not sure. Maybe they went to college and they have a degree. Maybe they just finished high school and they're not sure if they want to go to college. So again, there's a whole range of why and who comes to Pure Life. But the main goal is they want to work on themselves. And again, that could be more in the mental health realm, or maybe just more in skills and independence. I think Costa Rica does a lot of the work for us in that if you've been there, I know. And I think international traveling, just like going to other cultures in general, regardless of where it is in the world, stepping outside of your culture and your comfort zone and your known world, it helps us grow. And so I think that's a huge piece, is that the cultural immersion, getting outside the comfort zone. And then the other big component that Costa Rica provides is the connection with nature. So Costa Rica is, 6% of the world's biodiversity in this country the size of Minnesota, right? So it's incredibly diverse. It's incredibly rich with nature and just the ocean, the rivers, the trees, the mountains. And so I think that's a big piece that a lot of our students come for, is just unplugging from the busy chaos and the technology and the social media and the, just the busy pace of life in the States or in kind of more of the developed places. And in Costa Rica, you get to unplug a little bit and really just slow down. And being in Costa Rica helps me in that way, because it kind of forces me to slow down. I started coming here in my early 20s, actually, like not long after that job that I started with the BLM, I started coming down here and started getting into surfing. And then I just kept coming back more and more and more. And yeah, now I'm here full time. So.
Okay, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was like, there had to have been some sort of connection at some point where you're like, I've been to Costa Rica or just Central America, right? Like there's a reason why somebody's drawn towards that. And then to share, obviously, that you're a co-owner of a business operating in a different country. Okay, here's two things quickly. One, just for anybody that's listening, we'll make sure that we have the links in the show notes so you can connect with Allan or learn more about Pure Life in the show notes. So please check it out and also reach out to him so you can just, if you just want to connect with him, because maybe you're like, hey, I live in the Ozarks, or you're like, hey, I also took a road trip, or hey, I'm curious about Pure Life. Make sure you reach out. Okay, so, and then the second thing that I was going to say is actually a question. Now that we've heard your story up to this point, I have to ask this question because I ask all of my guests. Do you see yourself as successful?
Absolutely. Yes. I think a lot of that is that and it was through my process, I had to learn to redefine what success means. So for me, and again, that's the work I do with our young people, like probably one of the biggest pieces that I do with the students that come to Pure Life, people that I work with, is success can look different. And it's up to us to define that. So a lot of people would maybe look at me and, do I have the most money? No. But do I have a flexible life where I can go surfing in the morning and do meaningful work that I value, and like take my dogs to the beach and make a smoothie for lunch, and right? So it's like these life things that fit me that somebody else might not like. Like my lifestyle would probably stress a lot of people out. My sister, again, I love my sister. She would be totally stressed out if she lived the way I did, right? I spent years living out of a backpack, right? I love traveling. I love when things, and being in the outdoors, being an adventure guide, which is what I kind of did, and got me into working with students the way I do now. I was a guide for years after that, the BLM position in adventure and wilderness therapy. And so I lived out of a backpack and lived in my car, like camping, all over the West. And so in those things, I would say success is what we define it. And I think it's important to be, to be responsible and I am comfortable in my life. Like I have a nice surfboard. I have a reliable car, and I have a house. So for me, it's, and again, I think it comes back to like, what do you want and what are you willing to do? And what are you willing to sacrifice, right? Living in Costa Rica, I think a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, it's so amazing. Living in Costa Rica is hard. It's a developing country. The power goes out. The internet's not reliable at times. It rains like crazy, and there's a landslide, and you can't get to where you were going because, so there's lots of things living in a developing country that are challenging, and I love it, right? It works for me. And so I guess that's a long way to say yes.
I'm grateful that the internet worked so that we could have this conversation uninterrupted.
Same.
I'm also just grateful for you being willing to show up, share parts of your story. And I know, honestly, this was like, sped up. This was the like times, 0.5 version of Allan's journey, because it's hard to really condense it down to 30 minutes. So again, for anybody that's listening to this, if you are curious to learn more about him, to get to know him, to learn more about Pure Life, please make sure that you reach out. Allan, my gratitude is extended because I just appreciate your story, the work that you're doing, and like just who you are as a person. So I know that, personally, I just appreciate you, but I know that people will listen to this interview and be excited to connect with you. And so I just appreciate you taking the time.
Same. Thanks so much, Gianna. I really appreciate you. Always fun to see you and get to hang out.
That's it for this week's Success is Subjective episode. We want to thank our guests for joining Joanna on the show this week and for being willing to share your journey. This podcast would not exist if it weren't for people such as yourself. Stay tuned for our next episode, where you can bet it'll be another amazing human sharing their personal story with the world. Make sure you check out the show notes, where you will find contact information, website details, and all social media for our guest. If you're interested in being a guest on the podcast, you can email joanna@lilleyconsulting.com. Be sure to check out the lilleyconsulting.com website for additional resources outside of podcasting. Now, if you're listening to the show on Apple Podcasts, please subscribe. And while you're at it, feel free to leave a review. You can also download to listen to the Success is Subjective podcast on other popular podcast apps, such as Audible, Google Podcast, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn Radio. Thanks again for listening in. And remember, there is no single path through life. Success is what you make it.